Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to review the second half of Man Seeking Woman. So, this second half, really, to me, I'm getting to the point of ultimately saying that this show right here is probably my favorite show now. Move aside Dexter when looking at this show is so odd, and I love its odd approach. And I just feel like it's a car crash that ultimately like you can't look away from. But when looking at it, the episodes are so good and so kind of clever. And I think the problem with this second half is I feel like every episode kind of has a gimmick to it. But when also looking at each one of these episodes, I still find them hilarious no matter what. It also seems that in these episodes, it kind of feels like the main character doesn't have he doesn't have enough going on. I think in these episodes, to be brutally honest, like I feel like his actual story has to take the back seat for all of the jokes in this second half, where ultimately we kind of focused on Josh and like his story and his journey or whatever. I think in the second half, like the jokes kind of or the gimmicks in each episode kind of have to be more prominent than Josh himself. And then also, it seems that we eventually, at some point, start to focus on other people besides Josh. And I was perfectly fine with that because I'm like, yeah, like here's a way to kind of keep this show refreshing if they focus on also other people besides Josh. I'm completely fine with that because when looking at it, like this show isn't called The Josh Adventure. It's just ultimately just called Man Seeking Woman. And so ultimately, when going on to this show, I just thought it was kind of refreshing to focus on someone else but Josh. Even though more than likely on other things, I would probably complain about a side character being used. Here, I think it's perfectly fine because ultimately you want to keep the show fresh and you want to kind of like. I think it works perfect for this kind of show compared to other things, which normally I would gripe about. So going into this, I thought that this show was still hilarious. I think these episodes they don't go into using like monsters or absurd monsters for the most point. With the exclusion of maybe episode 9, there's a quasi monsterish thing being used in that episode. But anyways, we have it to where in the very final episode of this season, like it goes way off the rails of obscurity, and I really enjoy it. I really like the fact that they're like they know when to like take an episode and just go like, oh, okay, well, like what the f we're gonna do for the last big huzzah, and ultimately it's just like, well, just have Josh do all of this stuff and that'll be good, and we'll just go into ultimately having Josh's world almost end because of all the stuff that he is doing, and so ultimately, I applaud them for that, for trying to figure out how to escalate a story to one, utter obscurity, but also be like really holding into the fact that it's so freaking hilarious that you can't help but just go out like, yeah, keep going, keep doing it. Yeah, keep going to that far stretch of imagination that makes no sense. That's great. So I want to say again that ultimately I hope that I won't get anything kind of mixed around and or confused with this review. But always, as per usual, there are some times where through every episode, there's a lot going on in 20 some odd minutes, and ultimately, plus also reviewing 5 episodes in one shot. Um, there are kind of some repetitive moments in some episodes. There's a lot of times where Josh in the first half would go to the bar a lot, or there'd be like he would just be running through all these women, and so reasonably like there was so much that I would get confused about, or otherwise I would just be like, oh my god, like I can't remember every single girl's name that ultimately Josh had been with, or and ultimately I want to scroll through hours upon hours of IMDb just to find one girl for one episode. And so it'll just be easier to just be like, okay, well, this is Josh's new girlfriend in this episode, and this is Josh's old girlfriend, and so on and so forth. There's only so many actors that I want to remember, and there's only so much that I will want to go into detail about certain characters and stuff like that. So let's ultimately go into spoiler time about this episode. I so much find the show enjoyable, and not everybody else will, but at the end of the day, meh. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So ultimately, episode 6 is called Gravel. I'm hoping to be able to get every episode right. And ultimately, I wouldn't say episode names or numbers or whatever, because ultimately I feel afraid that ultimately I'm going to F something up. So, episode 6. So, this episode is called Gavel, and reason we have it to where Josh is seemingly landing a really decent girl to the point of getting into quite possibly some bedroom business. And we have it to ultimately Josh is to ultimately kiss this girl and to keep kissing her, and she is just frozen in his bed, and he's like, what the heck is going on? Ultimately to the point of like putting his finger in her eye, and she does not flinch. We ultimately find out that there are 3 aliens that simultaneously land into Josh's apartment because story. And we have these aliens that are demanding to sleep with Josh, to be able to have the bedroom business with Josh. To ultimately, Josh in reply is ultimately like, no, I'm sorry, I'm in a committed relationship right now. And ultimately they're like, well, but we're 3 women. And ultimately 3 women has to be better than what. And like Josh is just consistently like, yeah, but I really want to like be in this committed relationship. And we have it to where these aliens are really like adamant about all the things that they could do and everything, and Josh is like, yeah, I get that, but still, like, I like, so. And these aliens look exactly like, for the most point, normal women, with the exclusion of that they don't have the nips, or basically you just kind of you see them completely and utterly without clothes, with the exception of whatever weird hairstyle they have, which I thought was really interesting. And their skin is like white, and it like that is like probably the best way to approach aliens. So we ultimately have it to where these 3 alien women end up going away, and we have it to where Josh is telling Mike this story the very next day about, yeah, like, just 3 alien women just came down to my apartment bizarrely and was asking to make love with me. And Mike is like, seriously? And you said no? And he's like, yeah, like, I'm in a committed relationship right now. And just imagine if he probably would have went and tried and been with these 3 alien women, how more than likely eventually his relationship would have been broken up because of that. So we ultimately have it to here where ultimately we have seemingly where Josh ultimately says no to 3 women, but bizarrely we have it to where when Maggie comes a calling to Josh, Josh basically drops everything. We have it to ultimately Josh had seen some video about some mushrooms that ultimately he could have made for his girlfriend, and so ultimately we have it to where Maggie comes on in and ultimately says, me and my boyfriend broke up, and I'm so sad, and blah blah blah. And we have it to where Josh is ultimately trying to comfort Maggie, as while also calling his girlfriend to ultimately mention to her, like, yeah, I think we'll probably have to cancel this date. I'm really tired, and I'm really not feeling well. So all of a sudden, Josh hangs up with his phone after canceling this date to go into court for a judgment call, where ultimately we have the judge that is ultimately mentioning that Josh is doing some negative things with his date, and to where ultimately he's lying to his girlfriend while having another girl in his arms, kind of thing. And so ultimately, they have to really go and take him to court for that. We have a judge that'll ultimately making a ruling, and Josh is trying to figure out in which way to ultimately work around all this. So we ultimately have the judge, and this is like basically Josh is going out a door right into this court, and so we have it to where the judge is ultimately like telling him, it's like, well, like, you lied to your girlfriend, how could you? And ultimately Josh is like, well, I told her I was tired, I told her I wasn't feeling well. And ultimately every single time Josh does this, we have Josh ultimately crack open the Webster's dictionary to define things. And we have it to where the judge is ultimately mentioning, like, yeah, I know exactly what that word means. And so Josh has to also put up a very weird and or bizarre analogy. And like, I think the first one, he like talks about a peg leg and something like that, like a guy dancing, going on a dance floor with two peg legs or something like that. And so ultimately by the very end of this, we have Josh like mentioning that he's like, so, like, you can admit, judge, that I didn't do anything wrong. And so the judge is like, well, yeah, that's kind of true. And ultimately we have it to where the judge gavels, and we have Josh walk off to go back to Maggie and ultimately comfort her more, make dinner for her. And because ultimately it seems that he has more than enough food for two. And so eventually we have it to where Maggie and Josh are going to finish the show that ultimately they were going to finish before they were going to break up, called Carnival. And so we have Josh go back into the trial again, back into the courtroom again, to where ultimately the judge is like, hey, you are trying to have her watch the show that ultimately, like, that you two were going to watch before you're breaking up. Like, you're trying to force her to get back together with you. And Josh is like, oh, no, no, no. Like, if anything, it just so happens that we just so happen to like this same show. And so, reasonably, that's all I'm actually doing. And then Josh throws out another bizarre analogy that makes no sense. And then ultimately, the judge has to go in and mention that it's like, well, I guess you actually didn't do anything wrong. As again, Josh has to also put in another dictionary word that he read off of Webster's dictionary, and so on and so forth. This thing goes on like repetitiously throughout this entire episode, and so the judge confirms that he didn't do anything wrong, and so Josh goes off and ultimately goes and watches Carnival with Maggie. So eventually it seems that we have it to where, like, and this keeps happening consistently. I think it's like 3 or 4 times that they end up going through this whole judge and jury and execution thing. And to where eventually we have it to where uh, Maggie ends up spending the night uh, with Josh, and they don't end up sleeping together. She just ends up staying there. And eventually we have it to where Josh ends up having his new girlfriend come with him, or come to his apartment, and ultimately find Maggie there. And we ultimately have it to where Josh's new girlfriend confronts him about, like, oh, so this is the reason why you were sick. That's the reason why you canceled on our date. To ultimately have Josh, I would assume, go through the court system again and ultimately, like, debate all this, and then come back where ultimately he did nothing wrong. And so we end up having it to where Josh's new girlfriend ends up breaking up with him. And so when ultimately Josh ends up trying to get back with Maggie, we find out that Maggie was actually really drunk, and this was all one big mistake for ultimately Maggie to try to get back with Josh, because Maggie is just going to end right back up with this new banker guy that ultimately she is dating. So ultimately, everything is resolved with Josh ending up with seemingly no one. So moving on. So the next episode, we seemingly have it to where ultimately Josh is seemingly having a relationship that is going amazingly well, and ultimately it seems that we have it to where Mike is slowly but surely becoming a third wheel of sorts. So we have it to where ultimately Mike is feeling like a third wheel participant, and so we have it to where reasonably Mike bizarrely in these episodes is turning into what I would say would be a dog of sorts or a child of sorts. So we have it to where Josh and his girlfriend are going to this party, and Mike seems to wreck the party to the point where ultimately Josh is trying to take Mike into a separate room to ultimately say, like, hey, like, you can do whatever you want to do in a separate room, just try to be quiet and whatever. And so Mike ends up taking a hit of weed and stripping down naked and ultimately just flopping around all the ground. You can kind of eventually see his butt and his Johnson. And so we ultimately have it to where Josh and his new girlfriend are making the consensus that, like, you know what? Like, I think Mike is getting a little old. I think ultimately it's about time to probably, like, do something with him. Like, I think it's, I think it's about time that ultimately, he needs to go. He needs to go somewhere. And so, like, it feels like an old Yeller kind of, like, moment. So we end up having Josh taking Mike to seemingly this place where bros can go. So we end up having Josh doing the paperwork, and they're putting Mike in some prison cell. And ultimately, the program of which they're going to put Mike through is basically like adopting a pet. So we have it to where Mike is going to be in a prison cell for X amount of time, and then ultimately, if they can't find a new bro for Mike, ultimately they are going to kill him off. And so Josh is to ultimately see Mike in this prison, and it seems like he's conforming to everything. And so it seems like Josh at first is like, you know what, I think that this could work out for Mike. I think he can find a new friend, and ultimately everything's going to work. Before Josh leaves, Josh sees Mike one more time, and ultimately is kind of uh, like talking to him, and then eventually we have Josh going and seeing some guy who's ending up putting his best friend down. And so supposedly what ends up happening is whenever they have to put a best friend down, they fill him up with a ton of alcohol, and then they inject him with some needle that looks like a like one of those heart needles that ultimately like gives you really a lot of energy, but instead this is what kills them off. So Josh ends up seeing some best friend watching some other best friend die, and so Josh ends up going like, you know what, I think I was wrong about all this. I'm gonna get my best friend back, and we're just gonna make this work. And so ultimately that ends up is what is happening with that episode. I thought it was so absurd, but I again thought it was freaking hilarious. So moving on, so we eventually have a episode where it seems that Josh's relationship is working out so well with this girl that ultimately he is otherwise deciding to become Siamese twins with this girl. And because ultimately we have it to where Josh and his girlfriend are talking to Liz and her husband, and ultimately saying, like, you know what, I think our relationship is going so well, I think we should be conjoined twins. And ultimately Liz and her boyfriend are like, man, we've been together for 4 years and we would never want to do something like that. Like, so I don't think that you guys should do something like that. I think that that is too extreme. And so ultimately Josh and his new girlfriend are ultimately just like, nah, whatever. And so ultimately we have it to where Josh and his new girlfriend become Siamese twins and they're doing everything together. They're on the toilet, they're trying to hug one another and they're having problems and all kinds of things. So, and eventually we find out that Josh isn't trying to uh like kind of better himself, and ultimately his girlfriend is just not liking that. And so ultimately at some point we have it to where both of these characters eventually otherwise decide that, like, you know what, this is just not working out. And so recently we have it to where they are now like having to like mention what body parts they want and this and that. And so like we have it to where Josh is wanting the bladder and all these kind of other things. And so eventually they otherwise decide to tear one another in half. So we have it to where Josh is going to some bar with basically half of his body just bleeding out and everything like that, because ultimately uh, he is to basically like just have torn himself from his significant other, and like there's a blood trail ridiculously. There's also at some point we have it to where in this episode that hilariously, and somewhere in this episode, I'm not sure exactly where, but we end up having it to where Josh is ultimately talking to Maggie, and they are going and having tea with one another. And we have it to where Maggie is talking to Josh about how well her relationship is going and how everything is going so well for her. And we have it to where Josh ultimately, while he is talking to her, is just feeling so utterly miserable to the point to where his heart jumps out of his chest, and ultimately there's blood covered all over Maggie and there's blood covered all over Josh, but Maggie is still going on to this dialogue with Josh, and so is Josh also going on with the same dialogue with Maggie, um, because Maggie is announcing that she's getting married and everything is going well for her. And we have it to where Josh is ultimately mortified by how well everything is going for Maggie. So we have it to where eventually Josh is to go and seemingly be a part of this wedding, and ultimately we have it to where the worst place possible to be able to do this wedding is ultimately in hell, and that's ultimately where they go. So seemingly there's a whole entire wedding in hell. It's weird, it's bizarre, I get it. And so reasonably we have it to where there is seemingly like we have it to where Mike and Josh, like, they're ending up going together on this journey to go to hell. For some bizarre reason, they need swords to go to hell. They need weapons to go to hell, which is again weird. So we have it to where ultimately Josh and Mike are going to this wedding, and eventually they're having to sit next to the worst possible couple that they can be sat with, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where eventually a devil is ending up attacking Josh, and ultimately they're just like, Josh, where is your sword? And Josh ultimately mentions, like, I thought that that was optional. And eventually we have it to where there was a sword to be stabbed into this devil, and the entire time the devil is mocking Josh and all kinds of other people, uh, because ultimately, yeah, he had been slain, but that doesn't mean he's dead. And eventually we have it where Josh goes off onto his own to ultimately see some woman being tortured in hell, and ultimately he is asking for both the demon that is torturing this woman and the girl himself, hey, do you guys want to go back in and kind of just talk about things and just kind of like have fun. And ultimately, there's like, yeah, why not? And so ultimately, the demon and the woman that was being tortured are now going into the party and enjoying their time. So that is just another portion of some episode that I thought was utterly bizarre. But by and large, I don't remember what actual episode that slips into. But when I'm really looking at it, that was so absurd. So they ultimately have another episode where they focus very much more on Liz. It seems that ultimately we have it to where Liz ultimately breaks up with her husband of 4 years, and ultimately now it seems that Liz is ultimately getting rained on and getting like cats or something like that, like hitting her in the back. And so we ultimately have it to where I guess every time somebody is single, they have these bizarre journeys. I guess when they're married and everything is going perfectly fine, I guess ultimately their life is completely fine. But when they're single, that's when they get all these absurd stories going on. So we ultimately have it to where Liz, ultimately this episode is called Teacup, and Liz is to ultimately go and seemingly sit around with all of these young girls that are ultimately having a tea party. And we find out that every single one of these girls that are like seemingly like 9 or 10 are seemingly all married off. And we have it to where ultimately all these girls are giving Liz crap because she isn't married yet. And ultimately they're going and telling her like, man, like you're basically like a million now. Like you're so really close to death, it's ridiculous. And by the time that you're probably going to be able to get married again, you're not going to be able to get pregnant or have a child or anything like that. And we have it where Liz is like, oh my god, like I'm only 29. I have plenty of time to ultimately get another man and have a family and everything like that. And they're like, really, really, are you going to be able to? It's like, man, like, so we have it to where Liz is already feeling like her biological clock and everything else is just ticking, 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 ticking away. And we have it to where ultimately Liz is to ultimately go and be seemingly set up via somebody. And it seems that that somebody is a robot. If reasonably Josh had to be set up with a troll, now Liz is being set up with a robot. And so it seems that ultimately this robot is going and like being almost in a Surrey like fashion to Liz and ultimately kind of mentioning like, hey, these are a couple of topics that ultimately we can talk about. Current events, uh, past events, so on and so forth. What would you like? Kind of thing. And so we have it to where Liz is ultimately like talking to this robot, and he is telling her about past stories that he remembers her being in and stuff along those lines. And we have to where Liz is like, I can't believe that you remembered that. And we have to where the robot is ultimately mentioning like, well, of course I remember that. I know everything about you. It's stored in my databanks, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where Liz ultimately warms up so well to this robot that ultimately they go out onto the dance floor and start dancing. And of course, the only dance that the robot can do is the robot. And so ultimately we have it to where Liz and the robot are just dancing like robots. And I thought that was hilarious. So it seems that this date is otherwise going so well that Liz takes this robot into her bedroom, and we have it to where we have the robot ending up having to put on protection because he's a robot. But anyways, so we have it to where the robot goes inside of Liz and ultimately ends up uh, being like seconds in, he is already done. So we have it to where the robot ends up going like, well, hey, like, yeah, this is great and all, but I have a early morning. And Liz is like, what? Like, oh, come on, like, can't we just, like, kind of cuddle or whatever? And, like, the robot is just like, well, no, like, I feel like I am done here. And so ultimately we have it to where the robot just crashes through this wall and leaves Liz all alone. To where seemingly Liz is ultimately looking at old photos of her and her boyfriend, and we have it to where Josh is to ultimately uh, come into Liz's home, ultimately coming through the now crashed wall, and we have it to where Josh is ultimately asking about some girlfriend and how Liz could quite possibly help him. And of course, Liz is like, sure, like, I'll just help you, whatever you want. So, and I thought that these episodes were so hilarious. Like, the absurdity that they go out of their way to go into, I was just like, God, this is just freaking hilarious. So, the very last episode, we have it to where you understand how in convenience stores it seems like they have basically everything that they could quite possibly sell you in some convenience store. Well, it seems like we have it to where Josh is ultimately going on his way to going into this convenience store, and he is finding pills that ultimately can help him time travel. We also have Mike. Also, he had ultimately gotten certain kind of pills, but they have, I guess, horrible side effects to them. So we ultimately have it to where Josh's journey is to trying to ultimately seem to, like, his main goal is to try to make it seemingly work out with Maggie. And so ultimately it seems that Josh is to go back in time to ultimately talk to his self, and to ultimately mention to himself that ultimately, hey, like, try to keep Maggie, like, try to keep Maggie, like, whatever you do, try to keep Maggie. And so we have it to where now in what is to be present time, Josh had ultimately kept Maggie, and and ultimately he's sleeping with her and he's having a real good time. And we ultimately have it to where Maggie is mentioning uh, to Josh when they're at some bar, that ultimately she's like, you know what, I really like guys with a lot of facial hair, like, it looks really great. So we have it to where Josh goes back in time to the first time that his father is teaching him to shave, and this is when, like, Josh is like a really young guy or young boy, and we have to where Josh runs in onto this bathroom to tell his younger self, Josh, never shave. Like, give yourself to fighting facial hair. And so now we have it to where Josh in current time is ultimately seemingly being married to Maggie, and ultimately has this facial hair. And we ultimately have it to where Josh is seemingly at some point going to some restaurant, and it seems that he doesn't have any money to pay for anything. And so we have it to where Josh is going back to the time where ultimately he's in college, ultimately smoking a big thing of weed. And we have it to where Josh is grabbing onto himself at some point in time and telling his own self, Josh, never go to school for economics. If anything, go for accounting. And so we have it to where Josh in current time is ultimately now like an accountant, and it seems like he has tons and tons of money. And so it seems like things are going well with him and Maggie at some for some point, and it seems that also the world's completely changed, because ultimately he had mentions like, well, hopefully, luckily, I didn't completely and otherwise destroy the time continuum, the time continuum, and we find out that ultimately Josh is going to try to need more pills to ultimately time travel, because we find out that Josh is in a current time where ultimately there is an alien race that is ultimately dominating over the planet. And so we have it to where it's a current time where ultimately Mike is seemingly going and having to be a man forced to please an alien, let's just say. And he's wearing all kinds of leather and laces and stuff like that. And we have it to where Josh is meeting Mike, who ultimately needs help stretching for this monster to be pleased by him. And so we have it to ultimately Josh is quite possibly mentioning, it's like, well, hey, like, do you think that I would be able to like help you please this alien leader? And we have it to where Mike is like, nah, you it'd probably work. And so we bizarrely have it to where Mike and Josh are both pleasing this alien lord, this alien leader, and it seems that Mike ends up grabbing this giant stick to ultimately kill this alien leader. And we have to where Mike is in utter agony because ultimately this alien leader is now dead. And it seems that ultimately the world has been won. And so we eventually have it to where this alien race is no longer a thing, and I believe Josh is still no longer with Maggie, I believe, towards the end of this. Or I could be wrong about all that. But anyways, it seems that everything is going to go back to normal. It seems that yeah, like that all ends up working out and everything like that. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to get out and talk about in these episodes. They are very odd and very absurd, but I enjoy them all the less, or all the more. But anyways, and plus that last episode is so confusing. There's so many things that ends up going on. The last episode kind of gets really all over the place, and it is so just like, God, like I'm just trying to like find out the bouncing ball where all this stuff is going, and it's just madness. And so recently for the very last episode, it's very confusing, and there's so much stuff going on, and like they're really just compiling just a bunch of stuff all together, and it's like, good God, like I'm so overwhelmed by the very last episode, to where the point of it is that it's very confusing on that very final episode. So ultimately I could have really just gone and just reviewed that very last episode by itself, because good God, is it like all over the place. But I didn't realize how all over the place it was going to be ultimately. But nonetheless, I really enjoy the second half, even though I liked probably the first half better. Reasonably, because like it feels like they were just like for the first half you can kind of go anywhere with it, where kind of like the second half they were kind of like going to the same old like well, and like if anything like the jokes weren't as good as the first half. And but recently when looking at it, it's like this show had went on for a number of seasons, so looking at it, like just because something didn't go off as well as we wanted it to, ultimately it's like that's the good thing. Every single one of these episodes are all like going on to a certain theme or all different, so you can enjoy them for that. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed this review of me talking about the absurdities of all of these episodes. So, I'm going to go. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.